So with this, we have come to the end of template driven forms, right? And these are the different directives which we have used in template driven forms: ng model, ng form, ng model group, and ng submit, right? And these are the different steps which we have taken to approach the template driven forms: to define the name for the HTML elements, to use the ng model directive, to declare the template variables for the HTML elements, and the last one, which is optional, is two-way data bind. The next, in this video, we are going to talk about the reactive forms, the second kind of form in Angular. In template driven forms, the source of truth was your template, right? Your DOM, right? So you have been doing everything in your template itself. Your validation, your markup, everything was there in the template itself. Whereas here, there are things which are done in the component also. So here the source of truth is your model, which is your component. Your model is where your truth lies. So you will have to create the form control instances yourself in the component in reactive forms. Whereas in template driven forms, the form control instance was created by Angular whenever you use the ng model directive against each HTML element. But here you have to create it yourself in the component, right? Also, the validations have to be the validations should be done by yourself in the component, right? The form control instance has to be created by you by specifying what is the validation that has to be performed on the HTML element also. Here the data model is immutable, so the change detection process is very easy, unlike your template driven form where you use two-way data binding and then it continuously modifies the data to and fro. There is no problem here, right? So when do we use reactive forms is whenever your application is robust, it is scalable, you want a lot of reusability, right? In all these scenarios you'll have to go for reactive forms. In short, whenever your form is going to be very complex, when you're going to have a lot of validations in your forms, numerous fields in your forms, in that case you will have to go with the reactive forms. Unlike your template driven forms where only end-to-end testing is possible, since here most of the validation logic is written in the component itself, unit testing is at the heart of reactive forms, right? So unit testing becomes very easy in reactive forms. So what are the steps which we'll have to take for writing a reactive form? We had 4 steps in template driven forms. Here we have 3 steps, right? Step number 1, you have to do few things in template. So what is all you have to do in template? First thing is you have to use the form group directive against the form. You use ng form directive in template driven forms. Here you have to use the form group directives. Second thing is you used ng model directive for each HTML element. Here you have to use form control name directive in the HTML element. 2 steps in template. Second is in component. In the component, you have to create your own form group and you have to create your own form controls, right? The third step is binding these two which you have defined in the template and the component. Bind the form group and the form control name directives with the fields in your component. So whatever you have done in the step 1 and step 2, you have to bind them together in the component, right? So these are the 3 important steps in creating a reactive form. Now let's go back to our application which had user ID, password, phone and email, and let's try to convert our template driven form into a reactive form. Now this is the form. I have returned the form to its earlier bootstrap state, and this is how my form looks like now, right? I have removed all the template driven things from there. I've cleaned up the form. Now it is again the same old bootstrap form, right? Now let's use the reactive approach for this. The step number 1 is go to the template and use the form group directive to the form and form control name directive for the HTML elements. Let's do that. Use the form group directive to the form and use the form control name directive for the HTML element. Please note the difference in syntax for these two directives. So I have applied the directives for both. Next is go to the component and define the form group and the form controls. We have to define 2 things, form and the form controls. So first one is the form, the second one is the form controls. I have 4 form controls in my form. So what are the 4 different form controls which I have to create? User ID, password, email and phone, right? So these are the 4 different form controls which I have to create. I'm going to create these as objects, right? So new form control. Copy and paste the same for others also. So my form is nothing but a form group. So now we have created the form control instances and the form group instance in the login form component. We are done with the step number 2. We have to deal with the step number 3 now, where we bind the form control instances and the form group instances in the component to that in the template. So let's do that. To do that, we'll go to the HTML and then we will have to say form control name is equal to what is the name or what is the key which we have used in the form group object. So which is user ID. So I'll say user ID. Likewise, what is the name for the password? It is password. Same way, we have to bind the form group directive to the field in the login form component, which is the form, right? So I can say form group is equal to form. So now we're done with step number 3, right? So let's go back and see how our page comes up. Oops, there is an error. Now, when you see this, it says can't bind to form group since it isn't a known property of form. Right. So when we were dealing with template driven forms, we were using ng model directives. And as we have seen in the previous videos, ng model directives comes in with the forms module. So for template driven forms, we should have imported the forms module. Right. So in the app module TS, I can see forms module. But for reactive forms, we will have to import the reactive forms module. So I have imported reactive forms module here. You can do that, right? So reactive forms, right? There is no error. It is all fine, right? Now we have built up a basic reactive form using Angular, right? Now we will start adding the validation to all the elements in the form. Right? In template driven forms, we were adding all the validations in the template, whereas here we will have to add all the validations in the component programmatically. Right? So when you create a form control instance, you can see that it takes arguments here, right? So the form state is a default value which you want to appear in the form element. The next is a validator options, and it is of two forms, either one validator or multiple validator functions. The last one is the async validator. So synchronous validator and asynchronous validator, right? So whenever you have things which are sequentially going to give you some errors, sequentially going to validate your form controls, then you can see it is a validator. You can define your functions in validator functions. Now, for example, you have to trigger a backend call and you have to check if a particular user ID is actually present in the database or not. Then in that case, the API call is triggered to the backend and the response may come in the next second or in the second or third second, right? So we cannot wait for things to happen. In that case, we go for async validator functions. So I don't want any initial value for my user ID. I'll say empty and we can say the validator function. So what is the first validation which we wanted in our user ID? The required or not. So I can say validators dot, and you can see there are some validators which are already present, right? So I can use required. Same way, I want to say password is also a required field. For phone number, I have defined a minimum length of 10, right? And for user ID, I had another validator, right? So I have more than one validator, so it has to be an array of validator functions. Then it can be validator required validator, and it can also be validators dot min length. I want it to be 5. So this is what we did in our template driven form. So these are the things which we had defined in the template. Now we have defined it here using the programmatic. Right, now let's go to the template and add our validations. So here I have by default added all the validations. I have not given any directives here, or I have not checked any condition. So by default, when my form loads, it is going to display the errors. So you can see here, I have not done anything. I have not handled my errors at all as of now. Right, now let's go and handle the errors in the reactive way. Right, so in the template driven forms, we had ng model directives using which we were able to access the fields. Right, now we do not have ng model directives. So how do we access the fields? So to do that, ng if is equal to, I want to access the user ID field, but the question is how, right? So earlier it was exposed using template variable using that ng model. Now how are we going to do? The form object has a get method, and using this we will be able to get the user ID field dot if it is touched, right? Only if it is touched, display these errors, right? Yes, it works. I touch this and I get the errors. So form dot, the form object has access to, or it has a get method to access the form control instance. So likewise, let's define the other ng ifs also, right? So I say ng if it is touched dot errors dot required min length, right? Same is the case here, and I have to get phone dot errors dot. I have not added the touched condition, so let me add the touched condition also. Now I have specified all the required validations including min length and required, right? So let's go back and see how our application works. Yes, it is working, and I don't specify anything. It says it's mandatory. So yes, the application is working as expected. So now we understand how to do validations in reactive forms. Now, if you look at the code here, right, it looks a little bit of messy here, right? You're repeating this form.get user ID everywhere throughout your application. So instead of doing this, what you can do is you can create a property in your login form, right? So how can we do that? Let me show an example for one HTML element. So you can say get and user ID, and inside this we can return this dot form dot get user ID, right? Now we can go back to our template, and instead of writing this huge code, you can say just user ID, right? And yes, it. So now we have used all the inbuilt validator methods. What if I want to have some custom validation over my form? We always have a lot of custom validations in our forms, right? In our real-time applications, right? Now, similar way, I have a custom validation requirement that my user ID should not have hyphen in it, right? Let's go ahead and create a custom validator for this, right? So before we do that, if you check this, right, your validators, right, I'm accessing it using the validators class name, right? Dot method. So which means it is a static method. So when I'm creating a custom validator, I have to create a static method inside my validator class. Second point is it takes input as abstract control. The third thing is it returns validation errors. So these are the three things which we'll have to note down. So let's go ahead and create the validator, custom validator in our code, right? So let's create a new file. So let's name the file as user ID dot validator dot ts. So let's create a class. A validator is also a class, export class, and my validator is called user ID validator. And first thing, I should have a static method in my validator. So let's write the static keyword. What is my validator function name? Let me call it as no hyphen. Right? What are the arguments it should take? Abstract control. So let me say control colon abstract control. What is the return type? Validation errors. It should have validation errors or it may not have any validation errors. I have to import the abstract control class, which is also from Angular Forms module, right? Now, what does the error say? It says we should return a value, right? So here, let's write our condition. If control dot value dot. When you see, you don't get any intelligence because it does not know what is the data type. The data type here is any. Now let's use type assertion and let's make it as a string, right? I hope you remember that we have seen in the initial TypeScript basics that in order to get intelligence we can use type assertions, right? Dot. Now I get the assertion and I can say index of. Let me check if there are any hyphens. If there is any hyphen greater than or equal to 0, then I can return an object. An object can be as simple as this, or you can even say, or you can, for example, if you want to count the number of hyphens and return, you can say number of hyphens, and then you can construct as big an object as you want, right? You can pass any information about your validation error to the user of your validator, right? Now let's say there is a hyphen present and that's why I'm returning true, right? So now let's go back and see how we can use this user ID validator. Let's go to the login form component and then say user ID validator dot no hyphen, right? We have used the validator function in the component. Now let's define the template also, in the same way. So errors dot user ID dot errors dot. So what is that I'm returning? No hyphen. If it contains no hyphen, let me say user ID cannot contain hyphen. See, it says user ID cannot contain hyphen, right? So this is how we can implement custom validators. Now that we know how to do custom validation, we will have to implement asynchronous validation using custom validations, right? So how can we do? We already talked about what is asynchronous validation, right? We do not have the result of the validation immediately. We may have to wait for a while in order to see if the validation is successful or not. It can be a backend call, it can be a DB call or whatever, but there is a delay, considerable amount of delay, which will be there before getting the result. Now let's implement a validator function for that. Right now, I'm not going to connect to any backend system in order to get the results. We just need a delay there. So I'm going to set a delay of 5 milliseconds using set timeout method. Right. So let's go ahead and see how we can do that. So I can say static, because it's going to be a static method in my validator, and my method is unique, and the same arguments, which is control, and it is of type abstract control. And earlier we were returning validation errors, right? Now we will have to return a promise of validation errors, right? Because promise is for asynchronous programming, right? So we can resolve a promise of validation errors, or it can be a null. Now I can implement my logic here. So this is supposed to return a value. Here we had returned a simple object, but here we cannot return a simple object, right? We will have to return a promise. So how to return a promise? Return new promise. So now we have defined our validator function. Let's go to the component and try to use the validator function. Let's go to login form component and say user ID validator dot is unique. So, and the next step is we'll have to go to the template and handle it. So let's copy this and then say, so what is the key that we are returning from there? Is unique is the key. So let's use the same key here, unique, and then user ID has to be unique, something like this, right? So let's see how it works in the front end. So let me type something. Now after a few seconds our error will be displayed, right? So as you can see, after a few seconds the error is displayed. So this is about async validators in reactive forms. Now one other additional thing which I would like to highlight here is whatever we have is perfectly working fine, but there is another way to define the form group by using form builder, right? So when the number of form control instances are huge in our application, we can go for form builder. It is not going to reduce the amount of code so much, but considerably a little bit of code is reduced and the code looks little crisp and readable. So to do that, we'll have to say fb colon form builder, right? So here you can say fb dot group of. Here we can simply specify our form controls. Now even to specify form controls, we don't have to say new form control every time. We can just replace them with square bracket like this, right? So we can replace all of this with square brackets. So instead of writing this huge amount of code, the code is little bit reduced and more readable here, right? Also, when you're specifying the validators, please be sure that all the synchronous validators have to be specified in one list and the asynchronous validator has to be specified in another list, right? So this is about the forms in Angular.